Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson. Picture a city sliced in two by nothing more than a wire fence. On one side, families pull in around $30,000 a year. The streets are smooth asphalt, clean water flows from every tap, and hospitals are readily accessible when illness strikes. Teenagers fill the classrooms, dreaming about futures they actually believe they can build. Crime barely registers. Sure, the government has its problems, but citizens can vote to fix them. Life isn't paradise, but it's secure, stable, and brimming with possibilities. Welcome to Nogales, Arizona. Now take 3 steps south across that fence. You've just entered Nogales, Sonora. Here, families scrape by on roughly 1/3 of what their northern neighbors earn. Many adults never made it through high school. The roads are cratered and crumbling. Quality health care is a pipe dream, and parents constantly worry about infant mortality. Crime is rampant. Starting a business isn't just risky because of thieves. It's treacherous because of the suffocating web of corruption that can destroy your dreams before they even take root. For most of its history, the government wasn't something you turned to for help. It was something you feared. So what on earth explains this jaw-dropping difference? We're talking about the same patch of desert, same climate, same culture, same cuisine, same music, same ancestral heritage. Yet one side thrives, while the other struggles to survive. This single divided city unlocks one of humanity's most urgent mysteries. Why do some nations flourish while others flounder? Why do certain countries shower their citizens with health, wealth, and security, while others remain trapped in cycles of poverty, disease, and violence? For generations, we've been fed simplistic explanations. Some blame geography, claiming hot climates doom countries to poverty. Others point to culture, insisting some societies just lack the proper work ethic. Many experts argue it's ignorance, that leaders in struggling nations simply don't understand the right policies. Today, we're diving into a book that demolishes all those comfortable answers. In Why Nations Fail, economists Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson take us on a whirlwind tour through millennia of human history. From the Roman Empire to Mayan city-states, from Europe's Black Death to modern China's explosive rise, they've uncovered a hidden pattern, a secret code that explains why nations succeed or fail. By the time we're done, you'll understand this code. You'll stop seeing the world as a random patchwork of rich and poor countries and start recognizing the specific, powerful, and often brutal logic that has shaped civilizations for centuries. And you'll realize something profound. The poverty in Nogales, Sonora wasn't an accident or bad luck. It was engineered. Let's return to that puzzle in Nogales. If geography, culture, and ignorance don't explain the dramatic divide, what does? The authors offer a deceptively simple answer: institutions. That might sound academic and dry, but stick with me. It's actually revolutionary. Institutions are simply the rules of the game in any society. They're the human-designed systems that shape how we interact with each other. Think of it this way. In Nogales, Arizona, the rules actively encourage you to work hard, innovate, and invest in tomorrow. You've got access to solid schools. Banks will loan you money to launch a business. Most crucially, you know that if you succeed, you get to keep what you've earned. The government can't just swoop in and confiscate your home or business on a whim. Why not? Because the political system in the United States gives you, yes, you, the ordinary citizen, genuine power. You can vote, protest, and the law applies equally to everyone, including the powerful. These are what the authors call inclusive, institutions. They bring broad swaths of the population into both governance and wealth creation. Now glance south across that fence. For most of its history, Nogales Sonora operated under completely opposite rules. The system was rigged to benefit a tiny, powerful elite. Starting a business meant navigating an exhausting maze of bribes and insider connections. Become too successful, and you might attract unwanted attention from someone powerful enough to steal everything you've built. The law wasn't a shield protecting ordinary people. It was a weapon wielded by the wealthy. One political party controlled the system for 70 years, and challenging them could cost you dearly. These are extractive institutions. They're designed to extract wealth and power from the masses for the benefit of a privileged few. This is the beating heart of the entire book. Nations fail when they have extractive institutions, and they succeed when they develop inclusive ones. The most striking modern example isn't Nogales. It's somewhere even more dramatically divided, the Korean Peninsula. Until World War II ended, North and South Korea were unified. Same people, same language, same culture, same geography. Then came the split at the 38th parallel. The South, backed by the United States, built a market economy around private property. Its economic institutions, while imperfect, were fundamentally inclusive. They encouraged investment, education, and technological advancement. Today, South Korea blazes like a constellation on nighttime satellite images, with living standards rivaling Spain or Portugal. It's home to global powerhouses like Samsung and Hyundai. The North, crushed under the communist dictatorship of Kim Il-sung and his dynasty, chose a radically different path. It adopted the ultimate extractive system. Private property vanished. Markets were banned outright. All economic activity fell under state control, serving only a microscopic ruling elite. Today, North Korea appears as a black hole on those same satellite maps. Its people endure periodic famines, living with standards comparable to the poorest sub-Saharan African nations. The difference isn't culture or climate. It's the institutions imposed on either side of that arbitrary line drawn in 1945. This raises a deeper, more troubling question. If inclusive institutions so obviously create prosperity, why doesn't every country simply adopt them? Why would any ruler choose poverty for their nation? The book's answer is chillingly straightforward. Rulers don't choose poverty for their people. They choose wealth for themselves. And often, the most effective way to enrich yourself and your cronies is establishing extractive institutions, even when it impoverishes everyone else. Consider the Democratic Republic of Congo under dictator Joseph Mobutu, who ruled from 1965 to 1997. The country experienced virtually uninterrupted economic collapse. But while his people starved, Mobutu and his inner circle, cynically nicknamed the Big Vegetables, accumulated obscene wealth. Mobutu built a palace so extravagant it included an airport capable of landing a Concorde jet, which he frequently rented for European shopping trips. Wouldn't Mobutu have been even richer if he'd built a prosperous country? Then he could have stolen even more, right? Maybe he could have bought that Concorde instead of renting it. The authors argue no, and here's why. Inclusive institutions don't just generate wealth, they also distribute power. And that's something dictators like Mobutu can never, ever risk. Creating inclusive economic institutions requires inclusive political institutions. You need a government constrained by law and accountable to citizens. But that would mean Mobutu couldn't arbitrarily jail opponents or plunder national resources. A vibrant market economy would create new wealthy individuals who might challenge his political monopoly. This leads us to the engine of prosperity, and the reason elites in extractive systems fear it so deeply: creative destruction. This powerful concept comes from the brilliant economist Joseph Schumpeter. It means that for an economy to grow and innovate, the new must constantly replace the old. New technologies make old machines worthless. New companies drive established giants into bankruptcy. Think about how Netflix obliterated Blockbuster, or how digital cameras made Kodak film obsolete. This process makes society overall richer and more advanced, but it inevitably creates losers. And those losers are often the powerful. Picture England in the 1500s. A man named William Lee invents a revolutionary machine that can knit stockings exponentially faster than human hands with needles. He's ecstatic. He envisions making a fortune while helping his country. He secures a meeting with Queen Elizabeth I to request a patent. But the Queen refuses him flat. She explains, "Consider thou what the invention could do to my poor subjects. It would assuredly bring to them ruin by depriving them of employment, thus making them beggars." Was she genuinely concerned about hand knitters? Not really. What she and her successor James I truly feared was the political chaos that thousands of unemployed, angry workers might unleash. They worried this wave of creative destruction would disrupt the social hierarchy and threaten their own grip on power, and so Lee's invention was crushed. This story is human history in miniature. For millennia, from the Neolithic Revolution through the Industrial Revolution, humanity remained stuck in a poverty trap, not because we lacked ingenuity, but because those controlling power consistently crushed innovations that threatened their economic and political dominance. So what changed? How did the world finally break free from this trap? The answer lies in a long, contingent, often violent story that began unfolding in one improbable place: England. To understand why England was different, we need to travel back to one of history's most catastrophic events, the Black Death. In 1346, bubonic plague swept across Europe, annihilating nearly half the population. This was an unspeakable tragedy, but it was also what the authors call a critical juncture, a major disruption that upends the existing economic and political balance. Before the plague, Europe operated under feudalism. Lords controlled land, and peasants, called serfs, were chained to it. They had to work for the lord without compensation and couldn't leave without permission, a classic extractive system. But after the plague, everything shifted. Suddenly, labor became incredibly scarce. The few surviving peasants found themselves holding surprisingly strong bargaining power. They started demanding higher wages and greater freedom. Here's where a tiny, almost accidental historical difference created massive consequences. In Western Europe, including England, peasants were slightly more organized and lords slightly less powerful. When peasants revolted, like in England's Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the elites couldn't completely crush them. They were forced into concessions. Feudalism began crumbling. An inclusive labor market started emerging where people could sell their labor to the highest bidder. But in Eastern Europe, lords were slightly more organized and powerful. When their peasants demanded freedom, the lords responded by tightening their iron grip. They seized more land and intensified control over serfs. Instead of withering away, feudalism in the East entered a second serfdom, becoming even more oppressive. This was a massive divergence. A small initial difference in power dynamics, when struck by the critical juncture of the Black Death, sent Western and Eastern Europe careening down completely different paths. This process continued over subsequent centuries. England, particularly, experienced a series of conflicts that slowly, painfully shifted power from monarch to people. In 1215, barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, establishing that even kings weren't above the law. and had to consult with them for taxation. This was a tentative first step toward pluralism, the revolutionary idea that political power should be distributed among different societal groups, not concentrated in one person's hands. Then came another critical juncture, the opening of Atlantic trade routes in the 1500s and 1600s. In Spain and France, monarchies were strong enough to monopolize this trade. Immense wealth from the Americas flowed directly into royal coffers, making them even more powerful and absolutist. But in England, the situation differed. The crown was weaker and couldn't control Atlantic trade. A new class of merchants, traders, and entrepreneurs emerged, enriching themselves through trade with the Americas and Asia. These were new players, independent of the crown, and they resented the king's attempts to control their businesses and impose arbitrary taxes. They wanted more secure property rights and greater political voice. This new merchant class became the driving opposition force against the Stuart kings, who, like their Spanish counterparts, aspired to absolute monarchy. The conflict exploded in the English Civil War during the 1640s and culminated in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This was the turning point. The Glorious Revolution wasn't simply one elite replacing another. It was a revolution led by a broad coalition of merchants, manufacturers, and progressive aristocrats. They forced the king to accept a new constitutional settlement that firmly placed power in Parliament's hands. This created the world's first truly inclusive political institutions. And with inclusive political institutions came inclusive economic institutions. Parliament began passing laws strengthening property rights, dismantling monopolies, and encouraging trade and innovation. The government started investing in infrastructure, like roads and canals. A financial revolution began with the Bank of England's creation in 1694, making it dramatically easier for aspiring entrepreneurs to secure loans. This new, inclusive environment finally unleashed creative destruction's full power. Innovators like James Watt with his steam engine and Richard Arkwright with his spinning frame could now commercialize their inventions, confident their property rights would be protected and they'd profit from their ideas. The Industrial Revolution ignited, and it started in England precisely because England had undergone this fundamental political transformation. England's story illustrates what the authors call a virtuous circle. Inclusive institutions, once established, tend to create positive feedback loops that make them persist and even become more inclusive over time. Pluralism and rule of law mean no single group can easily seize control and create a new tyranny. When the powerful Whig Party in the 1720s tried passing the oppressive Black Act to punish poachers and protect elite property, they discovered even they were constrained by the very rule of law they'd championed. They couldn't just hang people without fair trials. The system they'd created to protect themselves from the king now protected common people from them. Inclusive economic institutions also reinforce this circle. By creating more equal wealth distribution, they prevent a small elite from using economic might to dominate politics. This happened in the United States during the late 19th century with the rise of robber barons like John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. They built massive monopolies, trusts, that threatened to strangle competition. But because America had inclusive political institutions, a broad coalition of farmers, workers, and small businessmen, the populist and progressive movements, organized and fought back. Muckraking journalists exposed corruption, and politicians like Teddy Roosevelt began busting the trusts. The system corrected itself. This self-correction process also drove democracy's slow, steady march in Britain. The elite who gained power in 1688 had zero intention of extending voting rights to everyone. But the logic of their system, that people have rights and deserve voice, proved impossible to contain. Throughout the 19th century, faced with mass protests and revolutionary threats, the elite gradually extended voting rights, first to the middle class, then to working-class men, and finally, in the 20th century, to women. They did it not from generosity, but because the alternative, crushing protests with violence, would have destroyed the very system guaranteeing their own property and security. But if inclusive institutions create a virtuous circle, extractive institutions create the opposite, a vicious circle. Extractive institutions also generate feedback loops, but they're negative spirals that trap countries in poverty. Those benefiting from extraction have the wealth and power to crush opposition and perpetuate the system. Political power becomes so valuable and unchecked that it creates constant struggles to control it, leading to instability and civil war. We see this vicious circle worldwide. Take Sierra Leone. British colonial rulers established an extractive system based on indirect rule, empowering paramount chiefs to collect taxes and control populations. They also created marketing boards forcing farmers to sell cocoa and coffee at artificially low prices, with the government pocketing the difference. When Sierra Leone gained independence in 1961, many hoped for change. Instead, the new leader Siaka Stevens simply hijacked the colonial extraction machinery and made it even more brutal. He used marketing boards to steal even more from farmers. He maintained the paramount chief system to control the countryside. The railway serving his political opponent's region, Mendaland, wasn't just neglected. Stevens had the tracks physically torn up and sold for scrap. He was willing to destroy the country's economy to consolidate political power. This is the vicious circle in action. And it gets worse. The constant power and wealth struggles in these systems often lead to complete state collapse, as happened in Sierra Leone with its horrific 1990s civil war. The state failed not because of inherent flaws in its people or geography, but because decades of extractive rule had destroyed any sense of law, order, and national unity. Sometimes the vicious circle takes a form German sociologist Robert Michels called the iron law of oligarchy. This is when revolution happens, but new leaders who overthrow the old simply step into their shoes and recreate the same extractive system, sometimes in even more vicious form. Ethiopia's story is tragically illustrative. The ancient extractive monarchy of Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in 1974 by Marxist army officers called the Derg. They promised equality and ended oppression, but soon their leader, Mengistu Haile Mariam, eliminated rivals and established a brutal dictatorship. He moved into the emperor's palace, sat on the emperor's throne, and began living in luxury, while his policies created a devastating famine killing hundreds of thousands. A revolution promising to break the mold only made it stronger. Why does this happen? The book argues that successful revolutions, like the Glorious Revolution or French Revolution, are usually led by broad coalitions. When many different groups unite, it's harder for any single one to seize total control and create a new dictatorship. But in places with long histories of extreme extraction, like Ethiopia or Sierra Leone, there often isn't a strong merchant class or organized civil society to form such coalitions. Power is the only game in town, and revolutions become violent struggles between one narrow elite and another. This brings us full circle. The world is unequal because of the institutions different societies have built, and these institutions have deep historical roots. A nation's path is shaped by its critical junctures and the small, often contingent differences that existed before those junctures arrived. But this doesn't mean history is destiny. The book overflows with stories of countries that broke the mold. Botswana, at independence in 1966, was among the world's poorest countries. It was landlocked, surrounded by hostile white minority regimes, and had just 12 kilometers of paved roads. Yet today it has the highest per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa, a stable democracy, and a prosperous economy. How Botswana got lucky. Its colonial experience under the British was one of benign neglect. The British didn't find many resources worth extracting, so they largely left indigenous Tswana political institutions intact. These institutions were unusually inclusive for the region. Chiefs were accountable to their people through an assembly called the Kagotla, where any man could speak freely. When diamonds were discovered after independence, the country's first president, Seretse Khama, and his party made a series of brilliant decisions. They vested mineral rights in the nation, not a specific tribe or elite, ensuring wealth was shared. They built on their pluralistic traditions to create a functioning democracy and used diamond revenues to invest in public services, education, and infrastructure. They shattered the vicious circle. The American South also broke the mold, though it took much longer. After the Civil War, the old planter elite managed to recreate an extractive system through Jim Crow laws, segregation, and voter suppression. But they were operating within the broader inclusive institutions of the United States. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s mobilized, formed a broad coalition, and used federal courts and legislation to finally dismantle the South's extractive system. The empowerment of black Southerners, combined with federal intervention, broke a century-long vicious circle. Even China, the great puzzle of our time, illustrates this principle. Its spectacular growth over the last 30 years wasn't some miracle of authoritarianism. It resulted from a radical, though partial, shift away from Maoism's extreme extractive institutions. After Mao's death in 1976, a critical juncture opened. Reformer Deng Xiaoping outmaneuvered hardliners and introduced market incentives, first in agriculture then industry. He created more inclusive economic institutions. But China's story is also a warning. Its growth has happened under extractive political institutions. The Communist Party maintains absolute control. Property rights aren't fully secure. Entrepreneurs who get too big or challenge the state can find themselves imprisoned, their assets seized. This is growth without creative destruction, and the authors argue it's unsustainable. Like the Soviet Union, China will likely hit a wall unless it transitions to inclusive political institutions. So where does this leave us? The story of why nations fail isn't a story of fate. It's not written in the stars, the soil, or the blood of any people. It's a story of institutions, of the rules we create to govern our lives. It's a story of vicious circles trapping billions in poverty and virtuous circles that have led a fortunate few to prosperity. And it's a story still being written. The Arab Spring protests, new social movements worldwide, the struggle for democracy and rights in every corner of the globe. These are modern-day equivalents of English barons at Runnymede, merchants challenging Stuart kings, and workers striking in Brazilian factories. They're all part of the same human struggle, the fight to move from a world where power and prosperity belong to the few, toward one where they belong to the many. When you finish a book like Why Nations Fail, the world transforms before your eyes. You start seeing the hidden architecture beneath society's surface. You look at the border between the United States and Mexico, or the stark contrast between North and South Korea, and you no longer see historical accidents or cultural quirks. You see the outcome of centuries of institutional choices. The most powerful lesson for me is this profound realization: poverty is not inevitable. It isn't humanity's natural state. Poverty is, in almost every case, the result of political decisions. It's created by elites who design extractive institutions to enrich themselves at everyone else's expense. This is sobering, but it's also incredibly empowering. Because if poverty is created by human choices, it can also be undone by human choices. The authors demonstrate that prosperity isn't about having smart leaders with the right advice. It's not about foreign aid or expert-led development engineering. Those approaches often fail because they treat symptoms, bad policies, market failures, without addressing the root cause, the extractive political institutions producing those symptoms in the first place. Pouring aid into a country ruled by a dictator is like filling a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The money just flows into elite pockets, often strengthening the very system creating the poverty. So what can we, especially young people looking out at this complex world, take away from this? First, learn to see the rules. When you encounter a problem, whether it's local government corruption, lack of opportunity in a community, or a failing school, don't just focus on the individuals involved. Ask yourself, what are the institutions? What rules of the game are producing this outcome? Who benefits from the current system, and who's losing? Understanding a problem's institutional roots is the first step towards solving it. Second, understand that real change comes from empowerment. The book testifies to the power of broad coalitions. The Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, the fall of apartheid, Brazil's rise. All these transformative moments were driven by the empowerment of large segments of society who organized and demanded change. It wasn't about waiting for a benevolent leader to grant rights. It was about taking them. This tells us that supporting a free press, protecting civil society organizations, and ensuring diverse voices can be heard aren't just lofty ideals. They're fundamental ingredients for creating and sustaining prosperous societies. And finally, be hopeful, but be patient. The book shows that breaking extraction's vicious circle is incredibly difficult, but it's not impossible. The stories of Botswana, the American South, and China show that even societies with long extractive histories can change their trajectory. But it's a slow, contingent, often conflict-ridden process. There are no magic bullets. Progress is a struggle. That was a summary of Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. We've explored the grand sweep of history today, from the first farmers to the modern global economy. But I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you make the journey yourself. This book's true power lies in the details, in dozens of stories connecting past to present in ways you'd never expect. This summary gives you a framework for understanding the world. If anything we've discussed has sparked your curiosity, I strongly encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history or economics. It's about gaining a new lens for seeing the very structure of our world. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets us know you're finding these explorations as fascinating as we are, and it ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.